All right, welcome everyone to our weekly webinar. It's very good to see you. A quick update. Many of you should be creating, we think, prison professor talent profiles, which of course is a mechanism that allows you to document your journey at no cost to you. It's something White Collar helps support through our nonprofit, Prison Professors. And there's a really cool testimonial function on prison professor talent that allows people to support you, to comment on the work that you're doing. I know in the last few weeks, people in our community have said federal judges, probation officer, and case managers have been reviewing their profile. I think it's super cool to know that you can create something and your judge or case manager can review your progress. And we're going to talk a little bit about documentation in our call today with Paul. To that end, it's a privilege to introduce my good friend, Paul Bertrand, to our community. As I described in the email, I met Paul many, many years ago when I was immersed in a government investigation. Paul, I'll turn it over to you if you can give us a couple of minutes on your background and what areas you focused on while working at the FBI.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And so when I knew you, I was an FBI agent in Los Angeles. Um, my first office was Los Angeles, and I was there from 1998 until 2010. And while I was there, I started off about 9 years or so investigating investment frauds of pretty much every type you can think of. A lot of them were boiler room type setups, and then any sort of mail fraud, wire fraud scheme, as well as corporate frauds. I had a few large corporate fraud investigations. And then for the last 3 years I was there, I was a squad supervisor of the mortgage fraud and bank fraud squad in LA. So we investigated mortgage fraud and bank fraud cases. And that was right during the mortgage fraud crisis, like 2007 to 2010 were the years that I was doing that. All of basically anything I was in charge of investigating or my squads were in charge of investigating had to do with schemes to get money and or money laundering and the like. But yeah, if it's chances are, if it's an investment fraud, even stock manipulation, insider trading, those as well, but anything to do with investments and fraud.
So this is helpful to hear, and I want all of you to know we can spend a moment or two how Paul investigated me, because a common refrain we hear in our community is, I have time to prepare. I've outsourced this work to my lawyer. There's nothing for me to do. And while you're thinking that, government investigations are, they're continuing, they're working. So Paul, can you touch on like the early stages of an investigation? Like, how do you get, in my case, like, did you get notified from UBS? Did a victim reach out to you? Because I had moved on from UBS. I'm like, I'm moving on with my life. Everything is great. I made a mistake. And then one day, months later, you showed up at my home and I'm like, what are these people doing here? So what happens when you learn or get the name of a potential target?
So somebody has to complain. And who it is that complains can be virtually anybody. Usually it's a victim that complains, that says, hey, I've lost money. I've been lied to, and here's what happened, and now I'm not getting any of my money back, is essentially the way this story starts.
This guy.
Very, very, very rarely, but it does happen, is somebody
Hold on, Paul, I'm sorry. There is a Kristen Blue who is speaking. If you could stop speaking. In fact, I'm going to mute everyone, and then Paul, if you can unmute yourself. So I just muted everyone. And then Paul, if you can unmute yourself, and then I'm going to unmute myself. Are you okay, Paul? Please continue.
Okay. Yeah. So what I was saying is usually it's a victim that complains that they've lost money. In very, very rare cases, somebody who will be a subject or eventually a target of an investigation comes forward and just says, I've been doing this. And And those are usually relatively shorter cases because oftentimes they kind of start with a plea agreement and maybe an information getting filed and then a disposition. But in a normal white collar case, especially in a place like Los Angeles, I would say if a case takes a year, that's really a fast one. And many of them go much longer than that. But in one thing you said, Justin, it reminded me from the time a case is open, a case might be one of only a dozen cases that an agent is working, but those cases don't stop being investigated until sentencing happens. And so it it for instance, like Justin was saying, when somebody realizes that like they've been indicted or the case is moving on, the agents assigned to that case are continuing to investigate right up until the day of and even during the trial. And then if there's more conduct still going on after the trial, then that investigation will continue right up to sentencing.
So in my case, for example, you showed up at my home and I didn't know that you were coming or that I was a target or witness or whatever. When you show up at some people's homes, are they just a witness or a target? Are you unsure what's going to happen? And I guess does their response help gauge what happens next?
So in your case, you were already a subject. And of course, the FBI doesn't make the decision to charge or not. That's the
Yep.
prosecutor, in your case, the assistant U.S. attorney. But but when an agent shows up at somebody's house, they typically at least have a thought of where the person fits in, whether the person's a witness or a subject or a target or a victim, and the interview is approached, at least started in that direction, but then sometimes during the interview, sometimes that'll change depending on what gets said or not. But most of the time, people have a role in the case, and really all the roles are pretty much either victim or witness or subject. And if they're not one of those things, then they're probably not getting interviewed.
So, what are some things the defendant can do when they learn that they're a target or a subject uh, to try to get things on track? I share this because people in our community will say, well, I have time, or I'm cooperating, that's going to keep me out of prison, or I've hired a lawyer and he's going through discovery. How can a defendant try to put themselves in a situation to position themselves for the best outcome?
Um, I guess number one, I would say if they have an attorney, listen to the advice of their attorney. Um, but if they don't, then priority number one would be, if they're going to talk to the FBI, be honest, be truthful, and tell the whole truth, not just part of it. Um, Otherwise, it's probably better to just not talk at all.
Is it true, in your opinion, when you interviewed me, you already kind of like a proffer, you knew the majority of the answers and you were seeking confirmation, or were you didn't know, or I guess a bit of both?
Yeah, that will happen in every interview. Let's just talk about subject interviews.
Okay.
And first of all, a proffer is usually what happens in the U.S. Attorney's office with the lawyer present and with the prosecutor present, and the agent may or may not do most of the questioning. Sometimes the prosecutor will do the questioning, but most of the time, in my experience, since the agents knew the details of the case best, the agents would do the questioning. But for an interview in the house, this isn't always the case, but more often than not, the subject interview comes pretty close to the end of the investigation. And So there's a pretty good chance that the agent has already talked to numerous other witnesses and numerous other victims. But beyond that, in a white collar case, very early on, like if we got a complaint from a victim, really the first thing we might do is start subpoenaing, bank records. If someone wire transfers somebody money, then we're going to be able to get from their bank records where it went. And then we're going to subpoena those bank records and we're going to see what was done with that money when it came in. And beyond just looking at records, the agents spend an awful lot of time creating Excel spreadsheets, for lack of a better term. And basically, like the way I would work a case is to make a timeline of the case, usually in Excel. And when you take a bunch of bank records and a bunch of business records and a bunch of emails and a bunch of witness interviews and start putting them all in a timeline together, like things start to appear. Like, for instance, someone received a letter in the mail and then they called a phone number and then they got a sales pitch and then they sent a check and then the check came in to the subject's bank account and then the money was immediately spent on a new Corvette. And the trail's really pretty easy from there. In more complex cases, it can go on for years, but the whole goal is to have a timeline of the case of what representations were made, what money changed hands, what happened to the money, what phone calls happened, what letters happened, what emails happened, what documents were produced. And
that, which is, I don't want to put myself through that.
I'm sorry, I'm going to mute everyone again. We'll make a change where this can't happen. If you could unmute yourself, thank you.
okay,
Thank you.
yep. And so the whole idea is that eventually everything we do might be in front of a jury, and that jury is going to make a decision. So right from the beginning of the case, we're attempting to put a storyline together that tells a story that can be told to a jury that just goes minute by minute, day by day, documenting what happened through the time period of that case. And when the story's complete, it's either ready for trial or ready for whatever's coming next.
You know what's so interesting about what Paul just said? We encourage every defendant, use our free stuff to do it, to document, to build a timeline, evidence of change in growth, why you're different than the government's version of events. Yet some people get in trouble, they're a target, they do nothing, they think they have time. If you do that, you are doing something totally different from what a retired FBI agent just said they did, which is build a timeline. They are working to advance their agenda, potentially prosecute you, while many of you sit back and do nothing and presume it's all going to work out or you'll get around to it. Nothing Paul just said implies I'll get around to it. He's working. That then leads to cooperating witnesses and how you make that determination. And then I want to talk about the results of cooperation. In my case, the government argued at sentencing that I was less culpable than my co-defendant, yet you found him first and he was on this path to getting cooperation credit. How is that offered? And walk us through just sort of how you determine if someone's going to be a cooperating informant or not.
Sure. So uh, if someone is already been introduced to the U.S. Attorney's Office, like that prosecutor will is heavily involved most of the time in whether or not someone will be able to cooperate and how much and for what. And all cooperation generally means is that most people can't commit a federal crime on their own, right? That other people are usually involved. And sometimes the best witness to have about other people's involvement is a person who was right in there with them. And so And so cooperation can be very powerful if a person is saying, yes, I did this, this, and that. And here's how the whole thing worked, and here's what everybody's role was. And the only people generally in a position to do that are folks that were somehow involved.
We've discussed that when you interviewed me and I lied, which was obstruction, that then made it more difficult for me to get cooperation credit because when you went back to UBS, my former employer, I wasn't in a position to help you. So lying to you, not understanding what I did, put me on a path to get a longer sentence. I'd like you to share the value or just talk a little bit about that for people who are interviewing with the FBI, who haven't fully come to terms with what happened or why they pled guilty, and how an FBI agent like you could say, this guy just doesn't get it. He can't help us.
Sure. So, I mean, you know better than anybody, the judge decides the sentence, right?
Mhm.
And so rather than say it, I was in a position to get a longer sentence, I would say that it put you in a position maybe not to get a shorter sentence. And what I mean is there's the sentencing guidelines, and the prosecutors are going to ask for what they ask for, and the judges are going to sentence what they sentence, but they do take the prosecutors' wishes and recommendations into account. And if you want that prosecutor to stand up there and ask for a shorter sentence, then reason they're going to do that is all based on acceptance of responsibility and cooperation. And so it's not that people aren't getting aren't getting the longer sentence. It's that they're not being in a position to get the shorter sentence. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And please continue if you want to finish that point.
Um, yeah, and to that effect, it is what it is. The sentencing guidelines are what they are, all calculated by a number of points. But then essentially what you're asking for is that downward departure. And so people can ask for downward departures for lots of reasons, but one of those reasons is acceptance of responsibility, and another one is cooperation, and that can be bigger or smaller with extensive cooperation.
Some people presume because they're cooperating extensively that is going to, excuse me, that is going to keep them out of federal prison, that alone. What is your experience with cooperators and avoiding prison? Your insights on that, please. Some people think it's a get out of jail free card.
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier, and in my experience, I can only remember one case where a cooperator completely got out of jail and got straight probation. Um, all of the other cases, and I mean, I between the squad that I supervised and then between my own cases for all those years, like everybody else got shorter sentences with cooperation, but none of them avoided jail altogether. Just the one guy that I'm thinking of, and he ended up cooperating with us on multiple cases, not only his own case but other cases for approximately 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, when his sentencing was eventually scheduled, um, then the prosecutor recommended no jail time for him, and the judge went along with it. No jail time, and just straight probation.
So I've been doing this a long time, so I know the answer. I've known people who have cooperated extensively and they haven't really built a record that shows they get it. Judge Gorton said this at a sentencing in Boston, like, yes, you cooperated extensively, it's going to help you, but I still don't think that you get it. I've also seen people who have wanted to cooperate. There was very little for them to give, but they demonstrated that level of remorse and contrition and got like surprising amounts of cooperation or credit from the U.S. attorney. So can you touch on, besides cooperation, does accepting responsibility and kind of building a new record that shows, I get it and I'm sorry, this is what I'm learning, does that influence stakeholders in your perspective?
Sure. Because there's only limited number of agents out there, and because your particular case might be getting worked on, that means there's other cases that are not getting worked on, right? And so, like, I can think of one defendant in particular who I'd like crazy the first time I interviewed him. And the reason I know it was all lies is because I spent the next year investigating everything he told me and proving that it was completely made up. And so literally I can't say he wasted a year of my time because it furthered the investigation. But if that guy had simply said, yeah, I did it, and here's exactly what I did and how I did it, that definitely would have made the case a year shorter and moved everything forward that much quicker. Um, and then of course too, when I did go back to see that guy a year later and he decided to come clean, that that pretty much ruined any chance he had of cooperating in the US Attorney's Office eyes, because there wasn't, I mean, he'd already wasted a year of our time running around following every lead he told us in the initial interview.
I'd like to talk for a minute. When some people interview with the FBI, they're scared. They're not prepared. They don't know what to say. Many people go to a probation interview. They're scared. They're nervous. They don't know what to say. And they might not deliberately lie, but their perception is maybe they've omitted details the government would deem important. So can you talk about, from your perspective, lying versus just omitting details that could be relevant to the case?
Yes. Um, yes. I would tell people, if they're going to talk and start telling the story, tell all of it. Because if somebody just stays silent, they're not omitting anything. They're just being silent. But if somebody starts talking and talks about all the other stuff except the bad stuff that they did, then they're omitting. Or if they start telling part of the story but not all of the story, when it's a, like, if there's a big elephant in the middle of the room and they go all the way around the room describing everything else and forget the elephant, like, then that omission becomes a big deal, because it's almost like it was on purpose omission. Does that make sense?
Yep. Do FBI agents, we frequently say the hardest part of the experience for many people is the waiting and wondering to get sentenced, right? The living, you just don't know. It's very difficult. Do FBI agents have any sympathy for defendants who are waiting years to get sentenced? Their lives are totally imploding, reputational fallout. Banks are firing us, DOJ press releases. Many of these releases we don't agree with or and think are one-sided. What is your approach to as you're investigating victims or investigating potential, targets?
Yeah, I mean, FBI agents are people, and people's level of culpability is a lot different. Some are just minor players who get swept up in things for one reason or another, and some are people who devise schemes to steal money right from the beginning. And and so it, like, I think it's impossible not to worry a lot as things like sentencing are approaching and how long it's taking. And I think everyone does worry and they should worry. But but sure. It, I don't know. In the case of defendants, for instance, who I was working with who may have already pled guilty and now sentencing is being delayed and delayed and delayed so that they can cooperate. They're talking to me all the time and they're actively involved in my ongoing investigation. So we're in essence working together to continue to investigate the case, and I'm on the phone with them frequently. And I mean, and so at least in those cases, I think those folks probably have a lot better idea what's going on than the ones that are just sitting there waiting.
I think some defendants, those who cooperate or proffer or just have spent time with the FBI, misconstrue the relationship. I have heard, oh, I spent a lot of time with them. I'm helping them catch cases. Uh, I think they like me. And they get taken in to a degree and think that that's going to lead to the outcome they want. Can you remind everyone you are a government agent? You're not our friend. You're out primarily for justice and focused on victims. I'd like you to reiterate that because hardly we get a lot of, I've been cooperating for 6 years. I spent so much time with the FBI agents. They freaking love me. I want you to touch on the relationship. And then also, how big of influence do you have on the US attorney in the recommendation that they make? Like in my case, David Willingham was the US attorney. You spent time with me. Will he say to you, hey, Paul, give me your thoughts on this dude? Where should I go here? Please touch on those 2 points.
Yeah, to answer that last one, they'll usually have an idea in their head of what they want to do, and based on the weight of all the cooperation, and they'll usually ask the agents, hey, what do you think of this? Yeah, I mean, sure. Um, and and yeah, in those cases, we'd offer our opinion. Um, Absolutely. And sorry, tell me the other part of the question.
Some people misconstrue or feel they have a unique relationship with the FBI agent
Uh,
because they've been cooperating, they've spent a lot of time together. And I have to remind them they're not your friend, they're focused on victims. And yes, you're helping them. But some people they don't think they need to prepare at times because of the cooperation, or they've paid back all of the money. And it gets in the way of building this evidence and record that you said you begin to do when you start an investigation. But you'd be stunned, like no defendants do exactly what the government does, and it doesn't make any sense. So just touch on this relationship aspect.
yeah, I think it's a misnomer to say that because somebody has a good relationship with the FBI, they're not going to go to jail. In fact, I would say in most cases, it's absolutely untrue. That clearly I would like to have a good working relationship with somebody. It's a lot nicer if we're, treating each other nice and working together and that. But at the end of the day, we're working towards the resolution of a case, and a case is only going to resolve in a couple of ways. It's going to resolve in a guilty plea and a sentencing, or it's going to resolve in a trial and a sentencing. And so the agent's job at the end of the day is nothing more than to tell the story. So even when we go to trial, the agent's not questioning anybody. The agent's just another witness who usually takes the stand as a summary witness. And that summary witness literally just tells the story from beginning to end. And so if the story is, I found this and I found that, and I talked to them and they said that, and then the question will come up, okay, and when you started working with the defendant, what happened? And then I tell that story. And so that's, you know, if there's a positive story and a productive story to tell, it comes out. If there's not, then it doesn't come out. Does that make sense?
It it makes a lot of sense. Can you touch on if someone's not cooperating, what they can do to still try to get the shortest sentence? Because in my case, I didn't cooperate. I squandered that opportunity when I lied to you. And for everyone listening, I lied to Paul. Nothing happened for a year. And then a year after Paul interviewed me, I read a headline in the Los Angeles Times stating that my co-defendant had agreed to plead guilty and was cooperating in an ongoing probe, and it named an unindicted co-conspirator that was me. I then called my lawyer who said, for the last year, while you've been selling real estate and playing a lot of golf, Agent Bertrand and David Willingham have been building their case. You're the unnamed co-conspirator, and I would encourage you to plead guilty to a count of conspiracy, and you can get up to 60 months in prison. That was a scary day for me, a difficult day. So I didn't have that opportunity, Paul. But in your experience, how have defendants still got good outcomes without having any opportunity to cooperate?
Yes, I have seen defendants who didn't cooperate get large downward departures at sentencing um, for a whole variety of reasons. And although I would say in your case too, even though like cooperation means a lot of different things, and and indictment and reading the headline is enough of a wake-up call to at that time say, okay, I should get started taking responsibility for this, then everything that happens from them up through pleading guilty and getting sentenced is very helpful as well.
So that's why when people ask, my sentencing has been delayed, is it a good or bad thing? The answer is it depends how you're using your time. Even though I lied, a year later, I agreed to plead guilty and I began to improve my record. I worked. Paul and I have discussed this. Working helped me build a record as a law abiding citizen. I was paying taxes. I was able to get letters from people that I had helped. Judge Wilson commented on every one. I began to volunteer and it was measurable. So, like, I couldn't change that I didn't do anything that Paul did when they started an investigation. Open an Excel spreadsheet, collect evidence, build a timeline, speak to people, collect assets, right? So those are 5 things we do. I chose to do nothing for a year and a half after UBS fired me. I had a lot of catch up to do. I'm hopeful because you're on this webinar, you're going to do it differently. Paul, there'll be some questions and we'll address them at the end. Paul, I'd like you to talk about something we encourage our community to do is create something that does not exist, an asset, and then share it and build it. How did you come across my journey after I had been in prison? Like, can you walk us through that? Because it's a lesson for everyone listening.
Yeah, I remember. Um, I think the first thing I found was the book you'd written from prison. I think it was called Lessons from Prison.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think you maybe or maybe not were working on another one called Ethics in Motion.
That is
And
correct.
and I remember I found those, and I at least the Lessons of Prison, I ordered them from Amazon. And I had absolutely no idea when you order from Amazon, if you're the author that wrote the books, you have all the books in your garage and you're filling the orders.
That's what I did.
And so when I got the book, there's a handwritten note on the inside of the cover that says like, "Hey, thanks for buying my book." Like, you know, and anyway, I thought that was funny, but that put me on to the yeah, all the blogs and everything else that you're already working on at that time. Sure.
So I encourage everyone, whether it's a book or a blog or prison professor talent, everything changed for me when Michael Santos in prison encouraged me to create something that did not exist. And by creating it, I could share it. Scotty on our team did that. So many people in our community have done that. Last week or 2 weeks ago, John Gustin on a webinar said, even if your initial release plan is on a napkin, lay out some vision of what you're going to do in the next week or 3 weeks and then write it on another napkin. Much like FBI agents are building their case through a timeline, you essentially need to do the same exact thing. And we're giving you an opportunity to build it and create it and share it incrementally. And influenced Paul to reach out to me. And it led to a myriad opportunities following my release, including speaking with him. Paul, I want to come back to investigations for a minute. When the FBI investigates someone, is that person's fate sealed, or have you interviewed people and based on how they respond, you tell the U.S. attorney, this, we don't recommend prosecution here? Or are there times where this guy's a target and we're going to let him go? Or is it once you have their file, it's kind of a formality? What have you seen?
No, it's actually never a foregone conclusion right up till trial. when I said FBI agents keep investigating right up till trial, I mean it, and during trial, and I've said this before. An FBI agent will keep investigating until they prove somebody not guilty. And what I mean by that is I've had plenty of cases that were never prosecuted because I found evidence along the way that suggested that everything wasn't as it seemed. That there's a misunderstanding of this person's involvement for one reason or another. And this piece of evidence, in other words, I might have 100 pieces of evidence that suggest someone's culpability in a case. But when I get that one piece of evidence that says they can't be guilty, I have to just close the case. I'm done, because I'm not going to charge a person. Like, I would never be involved in charging a person if I have any evidence that says that they're not guilty. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I want to come back to, I saw a message about proffers. You were at my proffer. You took detailed notes. It was really quite impressive, actually, how much you're able to write in a short period of time. And I saw those notes later, much later, and it's astonishing how poorly I responded to some questions, even when I thought I was answering openly and honestly. It was a lot of kind of blaming and deflecting. Can you talk for a moment about a proffer and how it could really help or hurt someone?
Yes. Back to what I said originally, the whole sequence of a crime is a story. And so if you literally tell the story from beginning to end, not leaving out anything. In other words, if there were things you did that you shouldn't have, if there is a time where you realize, uh-oh, this is bad, I shouldn't do this, and did it anyway, say it. Like, in other words, tell the story, lay it out, because at that point, especially in a proffer, you're sitting there in the U.S. Attorney's office proffering directly to the prosecutor, and it's typically under the Queen for a day, and nothing that you say in that proffer can be used against you unless you lie. An omission counts as the lie. So that's the one place you just want to tell the story, is that if the proffer agreement is there and it's signed, use it for what it's meant to be. And that's an opportunity to get the whole story told in your own words completely. And I've seen it go bad. I've seen it go bad when defendants lie during proffers or omit during proffers. And like I said, nobody's going to blame a faulty memory. Nobody's going to blame missing a detail or two. But if there's major parts of a story that are changed or are left out, that's a pretty big deal.
Something that helped me once I had a second opportunity, I shared something that they didn't know. In my case, my co-defendant would come to my office and take UBS letterhead, and he would send letters to his investors on UBS letterhead with my forged signature. And I always had an idea that he did it. And even when he interviewed with Bertrand, he said, Justin didn't know, Justin didn't know, like some loyalty to me. Yet when I proffered and I met with them and they asked me, I said, yes, I had a pretty good idea that he was taking the letterhead, and I turned the other way. And that was a different answer than Keith had given them. So I essentially got myself into trouble, I guess you could say, acknowledged bad conduct that they didn't know. But that's the sort of sharing more information, and things like that ended up helping me. Paul, I need you to discuss it one more time, reiterate, working openly with your lawyer. Odds are you know everything you're going to ask anyway, but if you're going to go in to speak openly, then be prepared to purge. It's the only way it's going to help you. Too many defendants just hold back and they miss huge opportunities.
Yeah, and I've had it happen to me many times before, where I've been sitting in proffers with defendants, and the defendant will say something, and the defense attorney will look me right in the eye and say, "Hey, we need to take a break. Can you step out for 5 minutes?" And during that 5 minutes, the lawyer would, smack the defendant around, whatever they needed to do, tell him this isn't going to go well if you keep down this line. And we would come back in, and the defense attorney would even say, "Can you ask that question again?" And we'd ask it again, and then the truthful answer would come out. And that's usually very helpful. It's, it's, yeah, I think in my experience with defense attorneys, they want to get to the truth as well.
Mhm.
And they don't want to see, the old adage, if you're in a hole, then, at least stop digging, right? And, and that goes within that proffer. I've had it happen to me numerous times where the lawyers know what's best for their clients, and the truth helps everybody. It helps further the investigation. It helps end the case. It helps make the victims whole. It helps. So, like I said before, if you're going to talk at all, tell the truth.
Let's talk about victims. And you said something earlier that was profound. Some people, I want to talk about perceptible victims, someone who's actually there. Like at my sentencing hearing, people were there to ask Judge Wilson to sentence me to 60 months in prison. When I got sentenced to 60 months in prison, they started, celebrating like the Dodgers won the World Series. And then there are those where there might not be an identifiable victim, and defendants tend to ignore that or say it's a victimless crime. First question, are victims calling the US attorneys like all the way through sentencing, prison, long prison sentences? Are they in your ear, the US attorney's ear, demanding prison, sending letters? And does that influence you as you're kind of going through this case?
So, yes, it definitely influences. And sometimes they're in your ear continuously, and sometimes not. Um, there was a couple questions in there, and like I've had victims where the impact touched me as well, and I really wanted to get justice for them. Yep. And then also you had brought up victimless crimes.
Like
And
a tax crime. Even people think, Medicare. There's a wonderful physician who like a year ago reached out to us. I did a YouTube short, and it was like $3 or $4 million to Medicare. He paid it all back, cooperated, and the judge still gave him, his guidelines were 31 to 37 months, and the judge gave him 34 months. And he's like, but I paid back all of the money. And even if I didn't, it's Medicare, right? Not recognizing there is still a victim here. And people tend to respond differently if they perceive it to be a victimless crime. They tend to more focus on themselves. And I know that can be off-putting to the government.
or I mean, I investigated several insider trading cases, and that's another one of those where like it's hard to identify a victim, um, except that the victim is, the market, right? In the tax crimes, the victim is the taxpayer. The victim is, and so yeah, but then there are those cases where the victim is a real person who lost their life savings, and now they have to move in with their kids when they're elderly because they don't have life savings anymore.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
You did. A client texted me. He's working. He can't be here. He said, I'd love to know what's one thing you wish more defendants understood about the way federal agents and prosecutors think? Can you take us into your mind for a moment? Your thought process.
Um, yeah, to sum it right up, when we open a case, we have an allegation that a crime was committed, and we may have an allegation that somebody did it if they know who. They may not know who. And then through the investigation, we start looking at records, and we start interviewing people, and we start building the story, right? That this is in fact what happened. And we get to a point where we believe that a crime was committed and this person committed it, and here's how we can prove it. And evidence only comes in a couple of forms, right? It's either going to be testimony, or it's going to be like business records, or it's going to be physical evidence, stuff you can touch. And so, like when I write a criminal complaint or when an AUSA writes an indictment, every sentence in that document has to have a piece of evidence to back it up. Like you can't have a sentence that's not backed up by evidence, whether it's testimony or records or physical evidence. And so when you ask how prosecutors and agents think, they think we have a story here and it shows through evidence that a crime was committed and it was committed by this person. And here's how we're going to prove it to a room full of 12 strangers.
So as we kind of begin to wrap up here, someone asked, are there any cases that you can recall that stand out where someone maybe really helped themselves or early in the investigation, and perhaps someone who really hurt themselves? I know I did, but is there anything that stands out where someone was truly exceptional and they really paved the way for a better outcome?
Yes, absolutely. There are cases where people get caught doing something and they get a lawyer, and the lawyer calls the U.S. Attorney's Office and says, my client did this and wants to plead guilty. And the case starts with an information. And in that case, there's not years worth of investigation that gets done. Remember when I said investigations take a year or two, it's like every single rock is getting overturned and peeked underneath. And there are definitely cases out there where people accept responsibility right from the beginning, and everything is written up and done within a couple of months. And at that point, they're just moving on with their life, almost as if like they need to get this bad thing they did out of the way so they can move on. And that seems to be the mindset right from the beginning.
What are your personal thoughts? I know you're retired, and Paul does. Maybe at the end you can touch on what you're doing now that you're retired from the FBI. What are your thoughts on sentences? Like I heard 18 months. I got 18 months. Did you think, yeah, that's the fair number for Justin? My co-defendant got 5 years. Because I served time in prison with guys that you had investigated. And what are your thoughts on sentence lengths? And just as you reflect back on your career?
I don't know. I'm really torn on that one, Justin, because I understand violent crime causes injury, but I've seen a lot of victims want to kill themselves, and I've had victims die from drinking themselves to death and kidney failure and liver failure because of the shame and embarrassment of losing their life savings. And, and so I've thought a lot about the fact that in white collar crimes like that, the sentences probably should be longer. They're typically measured in the 60-month range, less give or take a few, 30 to whatever. And then at the same time, though, I also understand that, you know, I don't know, I guess I'm just talking in circles, but I understand that people are people as well. And sometimes people fall into situations that get out of their control relatively quickly.
So what Paul just said, I don't know the percentage, but I would argue the lion's share of federal judges feel that same way. I've been to a number of sentencing hearings, Judge G, Judge Walter, Judge Wilson, who sentenced me, Judge Selna, Judge Carney, Judge Pearson, who said exactly what Paul just said. It might not be a violent crime, but I know people through your actions have attempted to take their own life. They're homeless. Grandparents have moved in with their family. And you may serve 2, 3, or 4 years, but this is going to follow them and their family for generations to come. So you've got to embrace this perception of how they think of you. And if you are not working to overcome this perception, you can't really say that you want to get a better outcome. And then I want to touch on something that has recently come up. Do you view people who might have had privilege and success and some wealth differently than someone like in my case? I went to USC. I had never been in trouble before. You could argue I had every break, and here I am, right? No excuse for me to end up in a courtroom. Do you view someone like me with this privilege differently than, someone who might have had a harder life growing up and things like that? How do you think that factors into an investigation?
Um, I would say in the world I investigated, everybody was pretty much like that.
In the white collar crime world?
Like in the white collar crime world, it's not uncommon for people to have, yeah, a lot of degrees and experience and positions and all the rest. And I've told you before, I think the difference is like everybody feels greed or jealousy or fear sometimes. And it, not everybody acts on those things. Sometimes they do. When they do, I guess the important thing is just to say, okay, this was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it. And here's how I'm going to not do it again and make up for what I did.
So when people say to us, I want to show that I'm different than my plea agreement or DOJ release, we always say, well, how are we going to do that? How do you do that? Now, some of you think, okay, well, my lawyer's going to do it, and there are lawyers on this call, and we pray your lawyer does it well. But I have to remind you that Judge Boo and other judges have said to a degree they discount what a lawyer says only because a lawyer's paid to say it. And a federal judge once said to me, I kind of discount a little bit of what a prosecutor says because I know they have an agenda too. Therefore, I need to hear directly from the defendant. I think one of the most profound things Paul said was when we start an investigation, I open up an Excel spreadsheet. I get evidence, timelines, documents, and records. That is consistent with what John Gustin told us and Chris Maloney told us. Why then would you be any different? Some of you will act on it, some won't. Some think, well, I have time. That is inconsistent with what we learned from subject matter experts. Let's begin to wrap up this interview, Paul, and touch on. Well, there's so many questions coming in and so many things that we can discuss. What are you doing now? Because I'd like to link to some of the resources because I know you train, I think, the Department of Defense. And what are you doing now that you've retired from the FBI?
So, yep, now I work for a company that makes trainings for suicide intervention. And so I work full time. I, I'm a manager of like the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic part of the country. I kind of like oversee and mentor and support like about 1,000 suicide prevention trainers. And we teach people how to talk to people who are thinking of suicide when they're thinking about it and how to help keep them safe, whether it's going all the way through putting the safety plan together or whether it's getting them connected with resources that can help them.
There are unfortunately people in our community over the years who have taken their own life from all sorts of cases. And we want to remind all of you there's a path forward. It's difficult, it's hard, the waiting, very lengthy sentences, I know, but at some point, the majority of you, all of you, you're coming home, which leads to how I want to wrap it up, Paul. I was grateful that you reached out to me upon my release from prison. Would you follow other defendants? Would you, Google them and check in on this dude or that dude? Were you curious? Because everyone, if you plead guilty, we all say, Your Honor, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. This is how you can hold me accountable. And some judges say, yeah, we'll see. Would you follow up and check in on cases that you worked?
Yeah, and the reason I'm laughing a little bit is because most of them didn't necessarily follow your path. Um, Sometimes I would get new cases from figuring out what old defendants were up to,
Hmm.
because sometimes, what is it? Leopards don't change their spots.
Yeah.
And so, there was one guy I'm thinking of in particular who our squad indicted 7 times and put in jail 7 times before a federal judge finally gave him 10 years and got sick of seeing him.
Hmm.
Um, and so, I wouldn't say as a matter of course, no, I didn't Google defendants, but sometimes I might hear a name and think, okay, yeah, I wonder what they're up to, and just see. And I tell you, if I put somebody in jail for an investment fraud and it's 3 years later and I see that they're offering another investment, I'm like, ooh, that's probably worth taking a peek at just to see what's going on.
That's, yeah, we had that issue with my co-defendant, and that leads to another thing. If you are cooperating or you've pled guilty, uh, don't break the law, because my co-defendant got indicted on new charges, and that actually was a big break for me because much of what he said against me they couldn't use. So it's, if you're going to cooperate truthfully. I want to close sharing something that just came in. Can you see my screen, everyone? You see YouTube here? Can you see that? Okay. So someone left a message like, how can you write a narrative before sentencing? I'm going to send this to you. This was an example of someone in our community. He literally retained our team, and the next day he was taken into custody. His judge told him, do not reach out to any victims. He did. And he said, I did it to apologize, but it was a huge no-no. And here's what happened. I've heard all I need to hear. Can we get the US Marshals in here, please? Okay, so I was there. It wasn't great. The judge took him into custody and he had a year before sentencing. So to the person who asked, what can you do with the narrative if you're in custody? You do exactly what Paul did when the government starts an investigation. You can write from prison. What programming are you participating in? What are you learning? How is it helping you become a law-abiding citizen? If you created victims, how do you identify with them? Have you set aside any money? You can't do the bare minimum. I'm avoiding problems. I'm doing my job. I'm being compliant on pretrial. That is required of you. It is not exceptional. And this person in our community wrote every day for a year. And as a result of that, at a sentencing hearing, he quoted Carl Jung, the psychologist, and the judge said, "You are what you do, not what you'll say you'll do." When I heard that, I knew our client was going to get a better outcome because he said he was going to hold himself accountable, and he did. So I'll share this with all of you. You should watch it, and you should do exactly what Paul does when they start a case. You should begin to build assets and evidence that currently doesn't exist. Whether you're in custody or not, it don't matter. Okay, please. That said, Paul, we're at 2 o'clock. I'm very grateful you've given us so much time. There are, like to know what I guess a couple other thoughts here. Paul, when I know, God, there's questions coming in. I'm going to share the recording with everyone here, not to worry. I guess, Paul, I can deal with those later. Any final thoughts, Paul, that you have as we wrap up? I'm so thankful that you've given us so much
Yeah.
time.
Just based on the one thing you just said, I just want to clarify a little bit, Justin,
Uh-huh.
and that is, building a narrative doesn't necessarily have anything to do with building reasons why what you did wasn't a fraud.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
get those confused.
Well, that's where some defendants get it confused, where they write it and they tend to justify the offense conduct or say, I did it, but, or I did it, however. And that's when we tell people, don't write anything at all because it's self-serving and it just kind of confirms what the government's perception of you. It has to be a narrative that's focused on, I would argue, the victims, lesson learned. And as Judge Wilson once said to a defendant at sentencing, I'm not convinced I'm not going to see you here again. Like I may see you here again as another defendant. So you want to create stuff that tries to demonstrate to a judge, this is my last time in a courtroom. That's where people get the narrative wrong, and they tend to only focus on themselves.
Yeah, I would definitely throw out there that if if the government thinks a fraud happened and a certain person did it, I would encourage people to work with their own attorney before they do anything else related to that subject matter.
Mhm.
Um, um, and then another thing to keep in mind is that when agents are investigating a case, they're thinking a crime happened and who did it, and here's the story of it. They're not investigating all the other aspects of your life,
Mhm.
um, such as what a good person you are and everything else you do.
Yeah.
Like that's not what's being investigated. What's being investigated is the crime, and here's how it happened. And so I think that's maybe more what you were leaning towards, Justin.
Our team is all about trying to demonstrate through our own efforts why we're a candidate for leniency, why we're different than the government's version of events, how we identify with victims and our plan to make them whole, even if it takes a lifetime, and to do exactly what Michael taught me to do in prison, which is to begin creating and sharing it. That asset that I created compelled you to buy a book. I sent it. I probably wrote on the inside too as a joke, I'm no longer unemployed because I made 15 bucks, which is what I tended to write inside the book. But I created something, and by creating and sharing it, my entire life changed. So to the person who I know is on this webinar who is concerned about creating something because their case manager might not like it, you don't live your life with hopes that a case manager is going to give you a thumbs up. I hope it influences your case manager, but maybe it will influence your judge to grant you an earlier release, or your probation officer to give you more liberty, as mine gave me more liberty, or the FBI agent that had worked your case to reach out to you after prison to say, good job. I'm proud of you. You're an asset. You've learned from this. Keep going, which is exactly what Paul still says to me 15 years later. You never know who it will influence, but if you don't create it, you have no damn chance. Zero, zilch, nada, because then you will only be judged by the government's version of events. Or as Michael liked to say to me, just let the Department of Justice do your marketing and branding and let me know how that goes. Only you can overcome that by creating. That said, Paul, I'm very grateful that you've taken time to do this. As a friend and mentor, thank you. I really appreciate it very much. Thank you for contributing.
Yeah. Thanks very much for having me.
All right, guys, thank you so much.